By the way, yes, we can share the presentation after, so any references, etc., are on the.
Thank you. We'll do it. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, that's perfect. Okay, we can move on.
Yes.
Yeah, because okay.
Okay.
Right. Okay, that's just the.
Just tell me when to move and I'll do it.
Okay. Yeah. Let's move.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is the outline, fairly typical. I did just want to mention that we would not have been able to do this research without all of the students and their teachers and the heads of the schools, everybody who's collaborated. And for this research, we did have a grant from the Ministry of Economy and Competition in Spain. Okay, so we can move on. And so this is one of the projects we've been involved in, and these are all of the people that have been involved in the project. And you can see here the link to the UAM-CLIL, and UAM stands for the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid. Okay, so it's one of the Spanish public universities that this research is coming out of. And what we're looking at is how the students transition from primary education to secondary education. So we can move to the next slide and I'll tell you more about the context. Public bilingual education, it's interesting because I think that there's, because obviously Spain is a Spanish-speaking country, a monolingual, except for the different regions of Spain where there are other national languages. But, you know, most people in the Madrid community speak Spanish. But, you know, at some point, because they wanted to increase the level of plurilingualism in Spain, they started a bilingual education program. Now, while there are some bilingual education programs in French or Italian, German, for example, the main one is English. And it started in 2004, and you can see in 2021, the great number of students who are involved in primary and secondary education where they learn subjects through English. If you could move. Kayla. So there is this transition from primary to secondary education. It happens when the children are 11, 12 years old. There's 6 years of primary and then 4 years of secondary. At the end of primary, they take a general academic test. They take it in Spanish, even when they've been in bilingual schools where they have all of their subjects except Spanish language, obviously, and math in English. But at the end of primary, they take these tests in Spanish, academic tests, and they also take a Cambridge exam, a CAT or a PET. And based on that, in secondary education, there are 2 tracks. So the higher immersion, they have more subjects in English. They have also, in addition to like physical education and art, which the low immersion groups have, they also have natural science and social sciences in English. Okay, so in secondary school, they are streamed. And so let's move on to the next slide. And so the CLIL project is looking at this whole transition from primary to secondary education from several perspectives: curriculum and pedagogy, the participants, and the classroom practices. Move, please. So the participants, that's the stakeholders, and I'm not going to be talking about that today, but that's what do people think. There is some opposition to the children learning through English. You know, there are a number of people who think they won't learn as well, they should be learning their mother tongue, etc. But we won't be looking at that today. The classroom practices, so move on, please. We won't be looking at either, but that is, there's some very interesting results about differences, the same teachers teaching through English and teaching through Spanish. something like social sciences. But sorry, we won't be looking at that either, but I might be able to answer some questions about it if there are any later. What we will be looking at, please move on, is curriculum and pedagogy. So that's looking at the students' linguistic competence. Now, I do have to say from the start, there's been no intervention. So there's no systemic functional linguistic informed intervention. We just want to know what happens to the children's English as they're learning subjects through the language, okay? So if we could move on. Okay, so, you know, and this is coming out of a content and language integrated learning. So language isn't just a carrier of meaning, but it also makes meaning. Next one, please. And so in that sense, content and language integrated learning is the norm for all learning. All learning happens through language and about language, right? In first language, second language, all curriculum areas, and at all levels. So next one, please. So the systemic functional model of language is perfect for analyzing content and language integrated learning and teaching, okay? Because language is the essential condition of knowing, as Halliday said. So next one, please. And so we're looking at this area of curriculum and pedagogy. We're looking across grades 6, 7, and 8. And also, we're looking at how students express their knowledge in English and Spanish, okay? Next slide, please. And so one way we could do this, and I'm sure you've all heard of genre-based pedagogy, so work especially by David Rose and Jim Martin on looking at the genres of schooling. Right? You know, these different ways of putting language together that are fairly regular, okay? Next slide, please. And a lot of time what you get, okay, one more. Sorry, animations. No, that's me. Okay, you know, often in genre-based pedagogy, what you get is the different stages of the genres are characterized by their lexical-grammatical features. You know, what kind of processes are used, how are they organized? But we're looking at a level that we feel is in between genres and the lexical grammar. And that's something called cognitive discourse functions, okay? And so we're looking at the construction of these cognitive discourse functions. And so I'm going to explain a little more now about cognitive discourse functions in the next slide. And then one more, because that's just a transition. Okay, so the thing about content and language integrated learning, it's really interesting because this is coming from work by Christiana Dalton-Puffer at the University of Vienna. And what happened was she was in a program, she was a linguist in a program that was combined with a faculty of education. And so all of a sudden, linguists and educationalists needed to be able to talk about things. You know, there needed to be this meeting point for subject education and language education. So the next point, please. And so she looked at, you can put all three up. There are two more. Right. So she brought together all of this work from education, from Bloom's taxonomy of cognitive functions, from work on the Council of Europe on language across the curriculum, and also from linguistic theory, speech act theory, systemic functional theory. And she came up with a taxonomy of like 50-some ways of talking about what is it that children need to be able to express, what kinds of things do they need to be able to do through language in school. So the next slide. So she theorized and put this, all of these different labels for those kinds of things children can do through language into 7 manageable cognitive discourse functions. So, you know, she came up with these. areas of thinking and language that children need to be able to express. If you just push it once more, through the research, she and Natalia Invitskaya have changed classify to categorize, okay? And I might say something about that later. So next slide, please. So again, these discourse functions, they're at the interface between cognition and verbal performance, okay? So they link subject-specific cognitive learning goals with their linguistic representations, okay, from the classroom. So next slide, please. Okay, and I think we're all familiar with SFL. Oh dear, see, I have too many animations. So you can keep going. You know, there's genre with register, discourse semantics, and which it can be divided into these different meanings. Yeah, you can continue. And right, so one more. Okay, so there we have the full map from Systemic Functional Linguistics. And so what we're going to be looking at is the lexicogrammar. We're not looking at the textual function through systems like Theme. We haven't done that with this data, but we are looking at transitivity, so the kinds of verbal processes the students are expressing, what kind of nominal groups do they use to construct what kinds of participants. We also are looking at the interpersonal function, things like appraisal, their use of modalization, etc. Okay, so that's the connection with SFL. And then these are our focus questions. Which cognitive discourse functions are realized, when, how much, by whom? And the main question today is, how are they realized in terms of lexicogrammar? So now we can go on to look at the data collection. So next slide. You can put all three up. There are two more. So this is all of the data we've collected. A lot. We have a ton. We're data rich. Okay, so we have lots of written and spoken text. And I'll be showing you a little bit about more specifically how we collected that data as we move along. And we didn't use all of the data in every analysis, obviously. It's a lot, but I'll be explaining how we chose the data to do some individual projects throughout the rest of this presentation. Okay, so the next slide. This is how we collected the written data. We would create a prompt based on the topic that the children were working on at the time of data collection. And so we created a prompt that obviously elicited these cognitive discourse functions. Christiane Dalton-Puffer, in her own research on classrooms, so she collected spoken data, she found these cognitive discourse functions actually difficult to find in the data. And that's significant even in and of itself, because if these are cognitive discourse functions that people are theorizing that children learn in school, then we have a problem if they're not using them, if they're not articulating them, because then how will they learn them? So we created these prompts, and you can see how the prompt is designed to elicit these different cognitive discourse functions. So we can go on to the next slide. So how did we do this? We broke up into pairs. Each pair was given one of the cognitive discourse functions, and away we went. And, you know, we would have meetings where we would check, you know, what do you all think? Do you think that this is an example of evaluation, etc.? Actually, I will say Rachel Whitaker and I did evaluation, okay? And we all used Mick O'Donnell's corpus tool. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's a fabulous tool for SFL analysis. So, you know, we would find an example of an evaluation, underline it, and mark it, okay? And I'll tell you more about the evaluation scheme later, okay? So the next slide. And we're just going to be looking at some of the results. And you might ask, why are these fish bowls there? And they're just a little reminder. Sometime on the left, we're comparing children of the same age. in Spanish and English. It's the same children writing in Spanish and English. Sometimes when they're jumping out of the bowl on the right, it's because we're comparing over time in that transition from primary to secondary. And I'll be telling you throughout what you're looking at, okay? So let's go on to look at define, the next slide. Okay, so, you know, this was a research question. Are there differences in English and Spanish? I mentioned earlier that one of the parents' concerns was that the children weren't going to learn in Spanish. Okay, so we wanted to know, are there differences in the way they express these functions in English and Spanish? Another research question was, are there differences across modes? So the next slide shows the data we used. One more. Yes. Okay, so that's how we elicited. You saw an example of how we elicited the written. The oral, there were similar questions, but they interviewed students as if they were speakers on a radio show. So these, you can see at the bottom, we looked at English and Spanish, and this is in primary. So when they're in sixth grade, so they're 11, 12 years old, okay? So we can go on to see how the data was analyzed lexicogrammatically. So we were looking for identifying relational processes. You know, according to Halliday and Matheson, these are processes where you have an identified and an identifier, and they're equal. So in a definition, that's important. Further, there was work by Trimble on definitions. So an ecosystem belongs to a class, it's a community, and what's special about that community? And then you get the you get further information about that class, okay? But there were, next one, please. There were also semi-formal definitions. Children would write a lot. An ecosystem is, and they would leave out the class. So it's like this, or it's like a food chain, and they would describe it. Okay, so there were formal and semi-formal. So now we can go on to look at some results. Just put them all up. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, that's it. Oops. Okay. Okay. Interestingly, there were no differences across language. Okay. Across modes, there were more formal definitions in written text. Maybe that's not surprising. There were more semi-formal definitions in spoken. That also meant that when the children were speaking, they would expand more on the definition. They would give more examples. They would give more description when they were speaking than when they were writing. So we can see there the importance of speaking in the classroom, because it allows children to expand on understandings and show the teacher that they understand what's going on. And again, there are more class words in written, but it wasn't a significant differences. Now, in Spanish, there were similar tendencies, but the differences weren't significant, okay? And we also did have, based on that exam they take at the end of primary, we had that information whether they were high or low achieving. And again, high achievers use more formal definitions when tested in English, okay? And that's probably not surprising, but it's interesting to note, okay? So we can go on to classify, okay? So I'm giving you a lightning tour of all this research. You can see on these slides, these are coming from that special issue where we do have 3 papers more in depth on our findings. But so the classify, and that's the one that changed to categorize after they did this research. So that was Natalia and Christiane. And they looked at 2 subjects across 2 languages. They looked at process types and participant types as part of their analysis using systemic functional linguistics. So the next slide, I think, gives some examples, okay? So, what kind of process did they use to compare? There was a lot more compare than classify. You know, they didn't put things into categories as much as they did compare two things. They were actually asked to in the prompt. So, you know, we got relational processes, we got material processes, there were other process types as we'll be seeing. And the participants of what they were interested in looking at was, were they concrete participants or more abstract participants? So the next slide, it just gives you some examples of the map of language that was used, okay? So all of the process types appeared, relational, existential, well, except verbal, okay? But obviously, as we can see, I think in the next slide, please. Okay, those are just examples of the nouns. Yes, here we go. So there were 90%, there were lots of material mental processes in history, but mostly relational and existential in science, which means that they're describing more in science, which probably fits with the field. There was a higher variety, as we saw, verbs in the first language than in the second, okay? Now, they use mainly concrete nouns, okay? They're still in primary school. That's probably not surprising, okay? There was a higher use of abstract nouns in the first language. So maybe the students are a little more comfortable with abstraction in their first language. So the next slide, please. But the truth of the matter is there was no significant differences in the conceptual complexity of the facts and ideas verbalized. There is a difference in the lexical richness, okay? But so probably we're seeing here, remember I said there was no intervention, an opportunity for focus on language in the content classroom, okay? To help children have this greater lexical richness to convey that conceptual complexity, okay? Now, we're moving on to another cognitive, yeah, put them all on. I can't remember how much is there. Yeah, okay, I think that's it. And so this was explore. So, you know, that's like, what would have happened if Columbus hadn't discovered America, kind of thing, you know? And so they have to use the system of modalization to be able to express these meanings. They also have to use the interpersonal system within appraisal of entertain, okay? That this might have happened, this could have happened, okay? So next slide, please. Again, you can see that this is, again, looking across the two languages in English and Spanish. I think it's the same data as the define, pair, analyzed, okay? So you can see the specific questions that were designed to trigger these meanings in the text, okay? So we can go on to look at the results. Oh, no, here's an example. Sorry, it's always nice to see the data. This is, you know, the real data from a student in the classroom. We didn't correct their spelling or anything, obviously. If he didn't discover America, all would change. For example, all the maps would be bad. The persons that live there would improve. They could come and they can fight with us thinking we are bad persons. I mean, really using the imagination, this student, okay? And this, oh, sorry, just, can you go back just one? Yeah. You probably not everybody here on speaks Spanish, but the interesting thing is we have this use of subjunctive. If technology hadn't been invented, the railway, we would not have been able to communicate, okay? And there are some errors in the Spanish use of the tenses here, okay? Because, you know, usually you have the subjunctive in one and the conditional in the other, and they have the subjunctive in both, okay? And that's interesting. So if we go on to look at the results on the next slide, maybe just put them all up again, yeah. Okay, so they can explore in both languages, as we've seen, and they have difficulties with the language resources in both, okay? So it's not that they don't dominate that use of the hypothetical conditional in English. They also have trouble in Spanish. And obviously they need these content-rich tasks, okay? Because when that forces them beyond the textbook, it forces them beyond what the teacher has said in class. You know, it draws on their imagination, okay? So this led us to talk as a research group about higher language cognition, okay? So thinking about higher functions. So if we go on to the next slide, you can put it all up again. Okay, we can go back to Bloom's taxonomy and thinking about lower order thinking skills and higher order thinking skills, okay? And, you know, we realize that explore is asking them to create through language, create ideas, create knowledge through language. So we realized that that was a higher order thinking skill. So then that got us thinking further about two of the cognitive discourse functions: evaluate, which is up there near create as a higher order thinking skill, and report, which is a lower order thinking skill. So if we go on to the next slide, oh, and one more. So we're going to look at these two key cognitive discourse functions that are distinct in terms of their drawing on higher order and lower order thinking skills. So the next one, please. So these are the research questions, right? And this is going to be across time now. Now we're looking across time between 6th grade and 8th grade. Are there differences, for example, in the amount of evaluation and report? And also, are there differences in the expression of evaluative meaning? So in other words, are the children, without any specific intervention, focusing on the language, only on the content, as content teachers tend to do? Are there differences in these two aspects of cognitive discourse functions? So the next slide. We use the appraisal framework, right? I don't know if everyone here is familiar with appraisal, but it's work by Jim Martin and Peter White on the interpersonal function of language. And what they did was they theorized that evaluation is expressed in 3 main attitudinal systems: appreciation, which is of things, events, phenomenon; judgment, which is of people's behavior; and affect, which are expressions of meaning. Now, we added on something to this framework, as you're seeing. And if you could just press one more, we can see the examples of these meanings. So we were interested in this: when do students justify their appreciations? When do they justify their judgments? Explain them, right? And when do they justify their feelings? So that's how we analyze the data. So the next slide, please. We can, and this is the data set. Sadly, in primary, students wrote in English or in Spanish. So we only had 27 texts in English. So where we have 68 texts in secondary from the students, the Corpus tool normalizes the data by providing the results per 1,000 tokens. Okay, so that's what we're going to go to look on in the results. The interesting thing, this just gives you an idea of the data. Notice that they are writing more in secondary, the average length of the text, so their fluency has increased in English. Okay, so that's just a little bit about the data. So we can go on to the next slide. Okay, so what we can see is there are significant differences in the use of evaluation and report. It increases significantly in secondary. So in secondary, they spend more time on the evaluation part of the prompt and less time on the report. Okay, so whether that is a development, again, with no intervention, but students just do more of it in secondary than they do in primary. Okay, so next we can look a little bit more. So these were the prompts that elicited, because it does create a difference in the expression of cognitive discourse functions, because in the one on the left, and that was primary, they could name an important person, so we can expect more judgment. In the one on the right, was it better to be a patrician or plebeian? There is also a lot of judgment, because they judge patricians and plebeians. Okay, so the next slide. We have some results. There's a lot of judgment plus justification in primary, because a lot of them chose an important person to evaluate, and they would say why they chose that person. Okay, and so that's just the pie. That's how they divided up their attitudinal pie. Okay, so every utterance that was an evaluate, then we decided, okay, it's an appreciation. Some students didn't answer the question, and that's why you see no evaluation. They just did not answer this question. The students who did answer it, the majority used a judgment and they justified it. Now, this pie in secondary on the next slide, we can see is different. So they were asked, was it better to be a patrician or a plebeian? Again, a number of students just did not answer that question. They just avoided it for whatever reason. But the ones who did, interestingly, rather than judging patricians or plebeians, they would use the impersonal it, like in the question. It is better to be a patrician because. But a number used affect, as you can see by the purple, because they say, I prefer to be a patrician, okay? That was interesting, that move from the objective, it is better, to the subjective, I prefer to be, okay? We're not sure why they did that, but a number of students did. So they expressed it as something that they like or dislike, right? And so that's why it's analyzed as affect, and then they would justify it, okay? So we found those differences across these two data sets. But more interesting, so if we go on to the next slide, is thinking about what are the targets of evaluation? Because we're looking at students writing in history. And are they the right kind of attitudes and the right kind of targets, okay? Because as people have seen in analyzing children learning history, they don't always get the attitudes. They will often judge something from their perspective now, what they like now, rather than from the past. So next point, because Caroline Coffin has also made this point, that they often have difficulty in assessing perspectives. So if we go on, we can see how we honed into this in a more qualitative way. We looked at couplings of value and knowledge, okay? So we looked at how they were, what were the targets of evaluation and how are they justifying their evaluations, okay? And we found some interesting differences. So if we go on, just put up the whole slide, yeah. One more, there, okay? So, whoops. Yeah, that's okay. So we were looking at what kind of attitudes were they expressing and how are they justifying them. Okay, so we can see both of those. I think it would be better to be a patricians because they had all the rights, control the government, or in art, the color rhythm is very good because of the progressive color changes. So now we've moved here to another field. And the art data was collected at the end of 8th grade primary education. The history data is from the beginning of 8th grade primary. So the children are, what, 14 years old at this age? Okay, so they were taking also a course in art appreciation. So we wanted to see, well, what are the differences in the field-specific meanings? Are they getting them right according to the criteria and standards of the specific field? So if we go on to the next slide, so we asked the question, are they different? Okay, and do they use criteria in justifying their evaluations? So the next slide. And so we know the question on the left. The question on the right is from the art data. Choose one of the paintings and comment on how effective the use of color is and why. So then we can go on to look at the results, some of them. So this is the data. We looked at very similar data from history and art. Similar age, though, beginning of year, end of year. Okay, so next slide. So our question was, did they use disciplinary justifications? And we can see in history, the first one they did, okay? They gave historical data to say why it was better to be a patrician. They had all the rights, they controlled the government. But the second one, I think it's much better to be a plebeian because they were the best. There were some, there was a whole range of meanings expressed in that second part, okay? The same in art, the first one. I don't know if it's accurate, but it is using the language of art. The objects painted in darker colors appear closer and smaller, and the lighter color appear further away and bigger. But the second one, this painting is good because the use of colors for me is perfect, okay? So we can see that they are justifying, but there isn't full control over the disciplinary specific type of justification, okay? So the next slide, please. So we're moving towards our conclusions. For evaluate the couplings, create a more field appropriate voice, but student writers still use a lot of just simple evaluation, no justification. And when they did include justification, some of them are drawing on their horizontal everyday discourse rather than the vertical discourse of the classroom, okay? Next slide, please. So, we can see that cognitive discourse, these cognitive discourse functions in the classroom allow us to think about that space, that intersubjective space between what the children know and what they express, okay? And while we don't find a lot on cognition in Halliday, he was interested in that intersubjectivity, how through interaction, we learn to use our language and learn about the world, okay? So that intersubjective space of the classroom is really, really interesting to think about the expression of cognitive discourse functions. And Rakaya Hassan drew on Bernstein in making that point as well. Through language, elements of what belongs to the collectivity enter a mind that belongs to an individual, and the outside becomes the inside, okay? So we think this area of cognitive discourse functions, and we can go on to the next slide, is fascinating to make explicit these disciplinary knowledge practices, along with their linguistic realizations. Now, we're hoping for a future project where we can do the intervention, okay? So we've been able to do the analysis, show, we've come to a lot of interesting conclusions about how these cognitive discourse functions are field specific. So they're changed slightly across fields, and that's of interest to the to the field-specific teachers, okay? So that's our hope for the future. If we go on to the next slide, we can see an example of a teaching moment that was lost because, you know, they're discussing in the classroom why Philip II was a good king or a bad king. And at the end, the teacher says, excellent appreciation, but doesn't say why. Okay, and that could be a moment to unpack. And so now we go to the last slide and we finish, and we can have a discussion or questions or comments. And thank you very much, and sorry for the technical glitches.
Thank you. Thank you, Annie. That was really interesting. Have I been a good assistant? Have I been a good assistant for you with the slide?
Marvelous. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, sorry for this technical problem, but I hope we managed, and we have managed to see the slides. Thank you very much for this enlightening work, and good luck with the project. I mean, this is very interesting to see, and I hope in the future we'll be able to have the intervention, because I think this is where the results of the project and the findings will be put into action. I mean, this is really very interesting. But this is really interesting as a starting point in exploring. I mean, I like especially this link between the cognitive discourse functions and the lexicogrammatical realization within classes, taking into consideration discipline. This is very hard work, and I guess you are a very good team to be able to do such work. Congratulations for this hard work, and good luck with the future work. Now, the floor is open for any questions, comments. Okay, you can raise your hand or you can put in the chat. Okay, Nasreen. Okay, we have a question by Nasreen.
Thank you very much, Anne, for this wonderful presentation. I personally learned a lot when it comes to the interface between theory and application, but I still think there is a third step which is perhaps missing, that is how to move from the results of the data into more perhaps how to apply new pedagogical methods in teaching these cognitive discourse functions perhaps in the future. Now, my question to you concerning the cognitive discourse functions themselves. You based the work or the project on a prior classification into 7 different types of main discourse functions. And really, as I worked myself on similar themes, I found it quite troublesome to see the boundaries or the real definitions or the specificities when you try to define what a definition is versus what an explanation is versus what a classification is, then the boundaries are really blurred. And my question is, how did you make the cut between these different types of discourse functions? Because I believe there are more similarities than differences. So perhaps there is something that you have used or a series of tests that you applied. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Yes, I can. No, you're right, Nasreen. It was very difficult because, you know, and a lot of people in SFL have objected to the cognitive discourse function as our unit of analysis, precisely because of what you're saying. You know, I think genres are fairly clearly defined and delimited, but you know, you're right, the cognitive discourse functions are a bit dicey. I can give you an example of one that I was supposed to be involved in early on, which was description, but we ran into great difficulty deciding if something was a description or a report. Because if I'm looking at a painting on the wall and I'm describing it to you, at the same time I'm reporting, you know, like if I say, okay, the woman is wearing a red dress, you know, what is it? So there's still some areas that we've not been able to work out. It was easier, for example, with evaluation, because what we did was we used appraisal as our way into the data. Okay, so you know, you're totally right. And that's not yet worked out completely. You know, I think I'll go back to that point about, you know, needing a bridge between language and education, and educationalists liking the cognitive discourse functions. And while we've not yet done the intervention, there is a current project where the researchers, and I haven't been able to be involved just because of my teaching schedule, but they've been meeting with teachers.
I mean, that definition, sorry to interrupt you, when it comes to definitions themselves, even in SFL theory, there isn't much data about it. There isn't much research. There's work by Harvey back 2001 or 1999, but not many studies published on these specific types of discourse functions. No. And I remember, just as an anecdote, when I first started talking about definitions as a form of elaboration in discourse, I had a sort of a resistance against that from the SFL community itself. So, because it's really troublesome to come to some clear criteria for the classification. So, thank you for that. Thank you.
Well, I agree, but I also do feel like you, Nazreen, that we need to extend SFL sometimes beyond SFL to be able to have conversations, you know. So again, educators appreciate this. It's something they do understand, they can understand, they see the value of it. And so we'll continue to explore that space, you know, that cognitive space with other educationalists. And that's what's exciting about the project.
Great. Thank you.
So thanks for that question.
Thank you, Anne. We have another question from Dr. Malaj. Faisal, the floor is yours, please.
Yes, good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you, Professor Anne. Yes, I'm really impressed by this very comprehensive presentation of the project. It's very promising, because it's bilingual, because we have the Spanish and the English bilingual paradigm, which is a bit similar to our Tunisian case. So I have a couple of questions, however. I'm going to start my first question from where Nasreen finished, actually. So the applicability. So how can educationalists and curriculum designers actually benefit from the findings of your work, and in which context? Is it ESP oriented, field specific, or is it translation, because you have the cross-linguistic dimension, Spanish English, comparing the cognitive functions in both between two languages? So the applicability potential. The second question is about the multivariate nature of your project. I mean, I'd like to ask about the feasibility of being involved in different tracks, like the English versus Spanish, and the mode distinction, spoken versus written, and the educational level, primary versus secondary, and the cognitive versus non-cognitive parameters, like I'm talking about, I'm referring to Bloom's taxonomy, because the cognitive dimension in Bloom's taxonomy represents, as you know, just one dimension, in addition to the affective, psychomotor, interpersonal, and skill-based, etc. So, to what extent, the manageability of the project, because I'd like to learn from this, actually, how to manage all these parameters at the same time. Bearing in mind the final objective of the work, which is actually applied linguistics or educational in nature. The final question is about the you mentioned your article, your research is based on on cognitive discourse functions, which represents only one dimension of Bloom's revised taxonomy. So, by the way, I have some reservations. I'd like to know about your opinion concerning Bloom's taxonomy. Developed in the in the 50s, actually, of the previous century, revised in 2001. Why have you taken just the cognitive dimension from Bloom's revised taxonomy, which includes the relational, the psychomotor, and the 5 dimensions, as you know?
Yeah.
And you have, on the other hand, in your eclectic, or let's say multidimensional model, you have taken all the aspects from the SFL: ideational, textual, and interpersonal. You have spoken about modality and textuality, which means theme reme, and ideational. This is my third question. It's about why this selection of the cognitive from Bloom, but the use of the comprehensive, the total model of SFL, comprising ideational, textual, and interpersonal. So thank you for this, for your patience, and these are my questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank
you.
Yeah, please.
Those are all wonderful questions. Thank you for those. The first one was, how can educationalists benefit from this research? And what we think is that there's been a lot of talk in the content and language integrated learning classroom. What does that mean? For a lot of people, like things like English medium instruction, you just teach them through English and you don't focus on the language. And so the purpose of this research is to provide educationalists with a way that they can focus on the language that is field discipline specific. Okay, and classroom specific. So, we're used to a model where children learn English in an English classroom, and they learn the verbs and they learn, etc. And then somebody teaches them through English. But this is providing a way for content specialists to work on the language of their discipline. And we've taken this, we've been working with teachers this year. And they do find it exciting because they bring a lot to that conversation. They're just not always aware of their language. I think a lot of people think language is a transparent medium, and I teach my subject, I don't teach the language. When we go back to Halliday, where all learning is about learning language. Okay, and this just makes it explicit. What are those language needs in the classroom? And that would probably answer your last question also. Why do we use the full range of lexicogrammar? Because we want to describe language as fully as we can, right? And so we use that. I mean, as far as incorporating other aspects of Bloom's taxonomy, I think it's because we went in through the cognitive discourse function, so we stayed in the cognitive domain. I mean, I think, yes, obviously there would be ways, and people have done this. They've used SFL to, characterize, describe other registers in the classroom that might involve the other domains, okay, especially maybe the affective domain. But we went in through the cognitive discourse function, so that's why we stayed there. Yes, interestingly, the other attitudes, I mentioned the participants' attitudes, the parents, the students, etc. Those have been analyzed not using SFL, and maybe they could be, okay? So maybe the range of meanings could be, but they haven't, because, there are ethnographers in the team, and people who, are more used to doing quantitative kinds of questionnaires on attitudes and things like that. So, and did I answer your 3 questions? I think I did. Okay. Yeah, I mean, in any project, we have to make choices because the project is huge. you know, and the data. And I have to say that the interaction is really interesting, the classroom interaction. One thing they found is with the students in the high immersion program, there's more explore. They explore more with those students. And in the low immersion program, so we see the problem of the streaming. The kids who are in the English sections are getting more of those higher order, they're creating more than the students in the lower immersion program. So there are some interesting differences. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, very interesting indeed. I mean, I do have a question about the parameter of low achievers versus high achievers, because I think my colleagues have been talking about intervention, and I think when it comes to intervention, this is where this parameter will be very important, because you will need more intervention with low achievers than with high achievers. I was wondering whether when you were especially when it comes to the analysis of justification and explanation, were the high achievers doing better than the low achievers? Did you take that into account in the analysis?
I don't remember the question before, but I did see a question in the chat about pragmatics.
Yes, pragmatics, yes. And the question about good and high achievers and low achievers. These are
right, yes. Okay, well, the high achievers, low achievers,
yeah.
There were some differences. You know, and a lot of that had to do with range of expression again. So yes, I think for teaching purposes, at the same time, I think things like reading to learn, David Rose and Jim Martin's genre-based pedagogy taken one step further. I think just making explicit the meanings. Often you can have students from a range of achieving levels in the same classroom. And that's where the intervention will be interesting, you know, to see how that works.
Yes,
okay?
yes.
And as far as the pragmatics goes, I mean, all I can say is that, you know, Halliday doesn't make a distinction between, you know, semantics and pragmatics. So, you know, in that sense, I guess, you know, we stuck to the semantics, the semantic dimension. But I mean, I do agree that it would be interesting to look at the pragmatic, you know, the way the students position their utterances, even pragmatically, especially maybe in the spoken data. Mm-hmm. But we haven't done that. So.
So maybe that's something else to think about.
Yes.
Yeah. You're right. I mean, we cannot focus on everything in the same project, but that's something to think about. Yeah. Maybe for others or for another project.
Yes, and we have a lot of data for any research student interested.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. Great. That's good to know. Good to know. Okay, thank you, Anne. Thank you for this interesting talk. Thank you for your patience in responding to the questions and comments. Thank you to all our participants for their questions.